October 31st is more than just Halloween. It is one of the most important days that occurred in the history of the church. If you go to a Protestant church, it is because of what happened on October 31st, 1517. Welcome to Classical Theology. I'm Dr. Huffling, and let's talk about the birth of the Protestant church today. The person who kicked off the Protestant Reformation is none other than Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, who was a civil rights activist in the 1960s. I'm talking about Martin Luther, who was a German reformer. Luther was a monk who lived in the Holy Roman Empire, what now is considered Germany. It became Germany in 1870 under the reign of Wilhelm I, really under his military genius, Otto von Bismarck. The city that Luther lived in during the Reformation, Wittenberg, Germany. In this video, look down to the bottom center, you can see a line of people walking in. This is a church with this big tower. This is called the Castle Church. And off in the distance, just above and to the left of this tall tower, you'll see the town church where Luther preached. Here's another picture of the town church in the marketplace in Wittenberg. There are two statues you see here. One is Martin Luther. The other is his protege, Philip Melanchthon. Luther was the genius behind the beginning of the Reformation, and Melanchthon was the genius behind the theology. He was the theologian of the Reformation. Here is another picture of these two churches. On the left, we have the town church, the Stadtkirche, and on the right, we have the Castle Church, the Schlosskirche. And the left church is where Luther, again, he preached, and the right side of that church, the Castle Church, is where Frederick the Wise had his church attached to the castle. And that is where we have really the kicking off of the Protestant Reformation. If you're listening to this on a podcast, you can go back and look at the video on YouTube later. Well, Luther found himself in the middle of lots of controversies in the Roman Catholic Church. We're talking about the early 1500s. We had a more developed papacy. The church taught that both works and grace were necessary for salvation, and they used things called relics to help with people's salvation and getting out of purgatory. If you know what purgatory was, it was a halfway house, still taught today, between heaven and hell, where you go to purge yourself. Purgatory, you would purge yourself or be purged from the remaining sins that the death of Christ didn't atone for. Well, the use of relics and indulgences would help get you out of purgatory. So the relics were these old things that had significance to the church. There were many, many of them. And for example, there was the head of John the Baptist. I think they actually had two heads of John the Baptist. Wood from the cross would be considered a relic. Milk from the Virgin Mary's breast. There were all kinds of things that were seen to be these holy artifacts. And if you would gaze at them and look at them, then you would be granted grace and time out of purgatory. You could do this for yourself, and there are other ways you can do this for someone else. That would also include indulgences. Indulgences was basically a payment to get one out of purgatory faster, and you could do that for yourself or for someone else. And this was the main controversy that the Catholic Church was in during the time of Martin Luther. Well, at this time also, services were in Latin, regardless of whether the people spoke Latin. If you went to church service, you got it in Latin. If you had a Bible, and you probably didn't, it was in Latin. Some of the priests didn't even have Bibles. So Luther was sent to Rome in 1510, 1511, and he saw the corruption there. He saw what was going on. He saw the practice of these indulgences. He saw the practice of these relics, and he just saw the general corruption of Rome, of what the priests were engaging in. It was just general corruption. So he went there, was sent by his mentor, Johann von Staupitz in 1510-11. Luther had a tower experience in the tower that he did his monkly duties in, and he was reading his Bible and meditating. He came across Romans 1:16. which says that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And he realized that it was really the gospel, not good works, that saved somebody, but it was the power of God in the gospel. And so in reading that, he learned that faith, salvation is by grace through faith. Well, during his discovery of reading the biblical text, we have John Tetzel come in. He was commissioned by Pope Leo X to raise money on behalf of Albert the Great to help pay back money he had borrowed from the Fuggers. It was a banking family. And he also was supposed to give some of this money back to Leo X to help pay for this great cathedral they were making, St. Peter's Cathedral. And so John Tetzel was around the town of Luther, and Luther heard about it, and Luther posted 95 theses onto the church doors of the Castle Church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. Why that date? Because he knew there were going to be a lot of people coming in to see Prince Frederick's collection of relics. Prince Frederick was the Prince of Saxony, where Luther lived, and Frederick had about 20-something thousand relics, and people were going to come and pay homage to them and look at them and get grace to come out of purgatory and all that. So they were going to come on November 1st, All Saints' Day, and so Luther thought that, well, if he nails these theses up to the church doors on October 31st, the day before All Saints' Day, people would see them. Make sense? Now, there are some people who argue that he never did nail these theses up. People will say that. But his compatriot and contemporary, Philip Melanchthon, says that he did. And so I will go with somebody who knew Luther and was very intimate about these situations, rather than somebody who lived 500 years later arguing against it. So I think there is evidence for that. And he nailed this list of 95 complaints or the 95 theses to the door on the church so people would see them. They were written in Latin. In fact, here is a picture of the door as it looks now. You see the church on the left. That is Luther on the left in that picture up top, presenting his Greek New Testament to Jesus, and Philip Melanchthon on the right, presenting his systematic theology, the Loci Communis, that he wrote. And I zoomed in on the doors here on the right, so you can see what that looks like. So that was written in Latin and was taken down off of the church doors. And there were really two reasons why the Protestant Reformation was able to succeed at this time. There had been other reformations or attempted reform before this, but there were two key ingredients to make the Reformation successful when it was. Number one, it was the invention of the printing press, which was not too much before Luther. And so people were able to take down the 95 theses and print them, and even in the local dialect of the people, which we'll just call it German. It wasn't German per se, but in that German kind of dialect, and pass them out so everyone could see them, the masses could see them. The printing press was very instrumental, without which the printing press existed. It wouldn't have a Reformation at that time. So the other ingredient was the political protection of Prince Frederick. Say it right. So between Prince Frederick and the printing press, Luther was able to get the Protestant Reformation off the ground and moving forward. He really didn't want to break away from the Catholic Church. He wanted to spur a Catholic academic ecclesiastical debate, which is why he wrote the 95 Theses in Latin. He didn't write them in local dialect. He wanted the people who were in the power of the church and the academia and all that, the clergy, to be able to have an academic kind of debate about this. But they were taken down and translated and given to the masses. Luther was brought before Cardinal Cajetan in 1518, the next year, and is told to recant, which he refused to do. He basically said, unless I'm convinced by plain scripture and reason, I'm not going to recant. And he did not recant in 1518. He began writing books in 1520, such as the Address to the German Nobility. And this was an attack on the idea that the Pope was the sole authority an arbiter of things having to do with scriptures and the church. So that was a direct affront to papal authority. The second was Babylonian captivity. This attacked the sacramental system, so that there were really only two sacraments: the Lord's Supper, communion or Mass, Eucharist, and baptism. It also criticized the church for withholding the cup of Christ from the church, and therefore withholding grace to people. In the Catholic view, and many Protestant views, they maintain that baptism and the Lord's Supper are sacraments, whereas Baptists hold that they are ordinances. To be an ordinance is more along the line of it's a ritual that we do in remembrance of something, or it's fulfilling a command like with baptism, but it doesn't give you grace. Well, in the sacramental view, it gives you grace. So the Babylonian captivity was an attack on the church's sacramental view. And then the freedom of the Christian man attacked the theology of Rome by asserting that each individual person was his own priest. He didn't need to go to a priest, but he had direct access to God and did not have to go to a priest. Well, Luther is then excommunicated and brought before the Diet of Worms, not the Diet of Worms, the Diet of Worms. Diet is an assembly, it's a meeting, council in a town called Worms in 1521. He's brought before the reigning emperor because he's in the Holy Roman Empire, so there are provinces, and Prince Frederick is the prince over one of the provinces, Saxony, and he is an elector of the emperor. In fact, the emperor was his nephew, Charles V. And Charles wanted Luther to come explain himself, and he promised Frederick safe passage to and from the Diet. So, goes to the Diet, again, refuses to recant. Well, when he is leaving the Diet, he is taken by some of Frederick's men and captured and taken to the Wartburg Castle. Here's a picture of the Wartburg Castle where Luther was very busy here. He was taken, he was protected, and it was here that he translated the New Testament from the Erasmian Greek translation, Erasmian Greek text, into quote-unquote German. Again, this isn't German until 1870, 70 or 71. And then he also translated the Old Testament. That was done by 1534. He was much faster on the Greek New Testament, because not many people could read the Latin. I mean, can you read this Latin? Many people cannot read this very well. So even if you went to church where you had a Bible, you wouldn't really be able to understand what was going on unless you knew Latin. And it was really more of the academic language at this time. If you were just living in Germany, you wouldn't really have known Latin very well. So he's kidnapped, taken to the castle. And then we have a reaction from the peasants in 1525 called the Peasants' Revolt, because the peasants realize that they are undergoing a lot of oppression, not only from the church, but also from the political leaders in the Holy Roman Empire or Germany. And so they revolt. And Luther wants to put this revolt down ultimately because he thinks it will harm the church's Reformation. And so Luther calls on the princes to put down the Peasants' Revolt, and 100,000 peasants were killed in this battle. In 1529, we have another Diet, the Diet of Speyer. The Diet of Speyer was held in 1529, and this said that the Roman Catholic Church was the only true church and arbiter of faith. Okay, to which Luther, the followers of Luther, read a protestation from which we get the term Protestant. So it's the reading of a protest at this Diet, the Diet of Speyer in 1529, where we get this term Protestant. Okay, we have an Augsburg Confession in 1530 explaining the Protestants' view of theology, followed by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which basically allowed princes in the Holy Roman Empire to choose which religion they wanted to follow. And it put the Protestants more in line legally with the Catholic Church. This peace of Augsburg was in response to some skirmishes, some military skirmishes, some fighting that was going on between the princes of Germany and the emperor. So it was a response to that and gave princes the ability to be Protestant. Some of the main points of Luther in this Reformation was that salvation is by grace and not granted by doing good works or by purchasing indulgences. And it was really this controversy of people paying money to acquire their salvation, their time out of purgatory, which Luther said only Christ can do through his atoning sacrifice of his death and his resurrection. But Luther also wanted people to have the Bible in their own language, and so he was able to translate that Bible from the Greek and Hebrew into German. And actually, interestingly, there was no unified German language. Again, Germany wasn't around until 1870 or 71. But the German of Luther's Bible became the catalyst and foundation for the German language. They have a lot of interesting history coming from that. Now, the Reformation was not merely important for the church. The Protestant Reformation also was very instrumental on political theory, on music, art. There's a lot of individualistic thinking for capitalism and putting the control in the people's hands rather than just the government. There's a lot of influence on how music and art are written and performed and made. The Protestant Reformation really touched in every area of life and had an immense impact on history. And it would go on to spread from Germany all over Europe, France, Britain, Scotland, and all over. And we hear names like John Calvin, John Knox, William Tyndale. These were people who followed in the footsteps of Luther. And one of the great benefits of the Reformation, apart from if you're Protestant and think that the theology is good, is the ability to have the Bible in your own language. Something that a lot of us don't really understand that that's such a big deal. Because I grew up just having Bibles. We got Bibles all over the place. You can see Bibles behind my desk over here. Got Bibles on my phone, iPad, all kind of stuff, computer, in different languages. And we take that for granted. But it was because of Luther and the Reformers that paved the way for us to be able to do that and have the Bible in our own language. Some people died because of this. In fact, it was a capital offense to own a Bible in English. So we owe a lot of gratitude, have a debt of gratitude we need to recognize that we should have for the Reformers, for Luther, for those who went before us, to argue for what they thought was a biblical view of salvation and theology in general, being able to have not only the Bible in our language, but also the service in our language. So my challenge to you, remember what happened on October 31st, 1517. Yes, it's Halloween, but also it is an important day in the history of the church. And if you're a Protestant, we need to understand our Protestant roots. Of course, there's a lot more I'm not going over. This is a very surface level approach to the issue, and we could go over a lot more details. There's a really good movie on the reference, two actually. One is from the 60s, and one was remade or made in 2003. It's just called Luther. I will leave a link to that in the description. It's a really good movie. It's well done, very accurate, and you'll enjoy it if you watch it. Consider the sacrifices of the Reformers and what they did. They really paved the way for us to be able to understand the Bible for ourselves. They took the center of teaching out of merely the hands of the Catholic Church and said that each person is a priesthood unto himself, and has direct access to God. If you're a Protestant, we probably don't realize how unique that is and how amazing that is, to be able to have our own Bible and be able to have direct access to God. That's not something that they had in the Catholic Church. You had to read the Bible if you had one in Latin, and you had to go through the priest. So we have a lot to be thankful for and grateful for the Reformers. So think about the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, study it, read about it, watch the movie, and consider how fortunate we are and blessed we are that God used great men like Martin Luther to help us reform and be able to have our own Bible, be able to have good theology, and know Him better. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe. We'll see you next time.